the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Cosby, Weinstein, Rose, Lauer, and O'Reilly. Just a few of the big names outed as sexual predators. The list has come from a range of industries and professions, including film, television, journalism, religion, law, medicine, literature, and politics. If one reaction has been surprise and dismay, another equally strong reaction has been, what took so long? And so our Challenge 2.0 program today focuses on the movement now known as Me Too, and the next steps needed for faith communities. And now I'd like to welcome our guests who were very much appreciative of taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. First of all, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Yohanna Kinberg, who is from the congregation Kyllo in Woodinville. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We have Reverend Pat Simpson, the pastor at University Temple United Methodist Church, and also, I think particularly important with this topic in mind, a board member of Faith Trust Institute. Thank you for joining us. Reverend Dr. Kelle Brown, thank you for joining us, pastor of Plymouth Church, United Church of Christ. Thanks for being with us, Kelle. And then immediately to my right, Reverend Kyllo of the Treacy Levine Center, of course, the producer, if you will, of this program, and Neighbors in Faith, and also a Lutheran minister who has served many different churches, many different settings as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. Me Too, next steps for faith communities. That's our topic. What I'd like to do before we really delve into the meat, which is going to happen very rapidly here, is just to ask each one of you, why is this topic important to you? Why is it especially motivating for you to talk about this and to act on this?
So when I was about 4 years old, I had a distant family member take me upstairs and try to undress me. And fortunately, my family was able to hear my cries and come and interrupt what would have been a really horrific event. It was horrific enough as it was. Also, as a pastor, I've uncovered sexual misconduct in 4 different churches. And so this topic's really important to me and how it impacts and affects so many people.
Absolutely, I can say me too. And I have found courage finally to be able to say it. And so for me, this topic is important because part of my call and my work is to make sure that those who are most vulnerable and oppressed find safe ways to express their experience, and hopefully to find ears that are keen on to deep listening, so that their circumstances might be changed.
I too have been hearing Me Too stories all my life. This is nothing new. In my work as a pastor, in my family, in my network of friends, and I've, looking back, come to see things in my own life that I didn't understand at the time. And I've also been part of the work of prevention and accountability in the church. So I'm glad that this new movement in new media has brought more visibility and given more people their voice and called perpetrators to account. But it's not a new story.
Yohanna.
I think it's especially important that religious organizations and religious leaders speak up and invite introspection within their own institutions, because religion and power abuse within a religious context has been a cornerstone of what's enabled this abuse to happen towards such a huge percentage of the population for so long. I can say me too, so can most women. And so part of this is also about truth-telling, that the experience of a large piece of our population, their human experience, hasn't been acknowledged, and that as faith leaders, we need to open up that truth.
I think each topic that we look at, that we're discussing publicly these days, has an iconic event that really pops to mind. And one very troubling event that just dominates my thinking on this topic right now is the case where the driver of a vehicle in Toronto plowed onto a sidewalk, killing 10 people. He identified himself as belonging to what's called, I understand, the incel group, and it apparently is taking root on the internet. And I guess that stands for involuntary celibates. Men adhering to this philosophy say they are entitled to intimate relations with women who, where, and when they want. Do you think that's essentially at the core of this issue we're talking about? And if so, what does it say about us?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. This is at the core of what we're talking about. At the basis of patriarchy and sexism and misogyny, violence against women, is this sort of exploded version of entitlement that we see in this incel movement. It's interesting to me because movements such as the incel movement will take the richness of other movements, like the civil rights movement, the movement for women's rights, the movement for those who are most vulnerable and oppressed, and take the same languaging. But I think this is a very interesting bastardization of what we have seen to promote those who are most vulnerable. And I don't know how one who benefits from male privilege can become more privileged. It's a silly notion to me, but I understand the power of it, and I hope that we can find ways to dismantle it.
Terry, you related your experience in dealing with this in 4 different church communities. Do you get a sense of an underlying attitude that's at work there?
Absolutely, and I think just as white supremacists sort of crystallize and make very visible in public white supremacy, the incel group and other groups like it make visible and kind of crystallize some of the underlying assumptions that our culture has and that men have with regard to women's bodies. And I feel, in a way, I feel if I could speak to those incel members, I would want them to recognize that human sexuality is joyous and beautiful when it is shared by both people. And that to objectify, to think that other people in the world owe them something is really not the point. They've been given the gift of life. And these young men are, in a way, depending on other people's response to them to be able to develop the meaning of their own life, and doing so in a way that expresses dominance and power over other people. And I would hope that they could begin to understand what human sexuality is really for, and not this sort of fantasy mechanical notion that they seem to be living out of.
What was interesting for me in studying the 5 books of Moses, as we do in our Jewish community all year, is seeing where many of the origins of this notion of women's bodies being property come from within the Abrahamic tradition. And within the context of the Torah, women have 2 possible ways of being in the world. One is to be the property of a man, whether you're a widow or an unmarried young woman, or you can be a prostitute. And we know from biblical times that men could sleep with prostitutes. That wasn't considered to be adultery, and prostitutes were the only ones who were free agents and had ownership of their body. Otherwise, it was within the biblical times a man owned a woman's body, and that's why it says a man can't have sex in Leviticus with his mother-in-law, with his sister. It goes on and on. It never says he can't have sex with his daughter. Why? Because she's his property, his sexual property. He owns her sexuality. So when I see these members of incel wanting to demand that they should have a young virgin maiden available to them, and that's part of their right as a male human being, I know where it comes from. It's rooted, and they're being told within some of their religious institutions, this is why you're here on this planet, and I can point to a text and and give you that confidence to go out into the world, maybe not to kill people, but to want to have that what they might view as a biblical kind of relationship with women.
One point that just comes to my mind is, as you've all expressed so well, this is not new. This is rooted in centuries and centuries of our history, but it seems to be emerging from almost nowhere, despite that history. Why now? Why are we seeing this now? Any sense of that?
I think it's being revealed.
Okay.
And I think the observers are changing a position where they're willing to speak. I think video has helped. I think hearing the bravery and courageousness of other folks who are survivors and victims has caused a revival and allowed for folks' voices to rise. And so I think the preponderance has always been the same. There have always been multiple cases I know in my community, in many families, in schools, in churches. It's always happened, probably to the same degree it is now. But now the visibility is different.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's one more thing, and that is, as those voices have come forward, in some areas there are women with enough power then to stand up, tell their own stories, and stand with the less powerful victims. You saw that in the Hollywood response. The black dresses, the naming at the Oscars. And that makes a difference too. I think it's made a difference in Christian churches, where there's some women among bishops or other leaders with clerical power who can make space and move the system to call people to account when they're revealed to be perpetrators.
Yes.
Is that true in your tradition too?
Yeah, we've had the Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movements. We've had women being ordained since the early 70s, and about 50% of the people who are becoming ordained are females, and so it's changing rapidly. I think that one of the reasons this is a lot of the tensions are coming to arise, and a lot of unveiling and revealing is happening, is also that there's an economic reality, which is that a lot of women don't have to get married. They can say no. I can earn a living and support myself and have a child if I want to, but I don't have to partner myself with a man to be in this world. And then there's the economic reality that it's very hard for men to support themselves just on one income. So we have all these changes happening in our society, and I see that especially younger women, millennials, unless they find someone who they really want to partner with, they're just not going to. They don't have to. And I think that leads to, if there's a sense of entitlement on the part of men that they should be provided with a wife, it's not going to fly that much anymore in this society. And there's an anger there.
I can imagine. This has cut across so many different fields. We've heard a lot out of film, out of broadcasting, medicine, law, literature, etc. Addressing the faith communities, which all of you serve so well, what particular damage is done when a faith leader is implicated in activity, behavior of this sort?
As a person that's uncovered sexual misconduct in 3 churches by previous clergy, the effects are devastating. People lose trust in themselves because they began to trust this other person. They begin to lose trust in other human beings. They often experience a lot of pain in their sexual expression of themselves in other relationships. And they also, because many clergy use God language or theology to justify, either by saying, well, everything goes, everything's okay, God loves everybody, or by saying, well, human beings are totally depraved and therefore we can't control ourselves. So those are the two ways it gets expressed theologically in my experience. And folk end up sort of losing touch with and trust in God and in life in general.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a distrust that all of us feel, probably as faith leaders. I think there's a distrust implicit in terms of how congregants relate to you, even as women. I believe women clergy experience that as well. And so because there is the preponderance of hiding in the church context, it just behooves us to really speak truth to power and to really honor the voices that are rising so that we can try to repair the breach that's created in the context of churches. But also to be above reproach, there's an incredible stress that's implicit in our engagement with others, so that we must take care of ourselves and be in relationship and do what we must so that we reduce the chance of stepping outside. But if we do, I think it just behooves us to step up and to align ourselves with some organization or structure so that we can go through the process and not continue to perpetuate the pain that we may have stepped into.
As we've seen the proportion of people that are affiliated with what other faith institution they might normally be affiliated with, and those that are not affiliated, do you think that this kind of behavior, this perception of behavior, if nothing else, is behind some of that change?
People stepping away from religion? Absolutely. I think that, to walk into a sanctuary, to walk into a sacred space is to make yourself vulnerable. And if you have any fear there that your openness and your vulnerability is going to be attacked or taken advantage of, it's very, very dangerous. People, and especially when there's money involved and power, all that stuff, people just say, I don't want any of that if that's what religion's all about. And things are definitely changing, but it's hard to get people to come back and trust again and to feel open to making themselves open to you and to anyone expressing to you what the divine is in this world. It's just too intimate for some.
Yeah. Faith communities look like dangerous places, particularly for children. I want to say also there's some spiritual damage that we haven't fully named yet. What does it mean if the person using the name of God uses that trust, that divine authorization to abuse me? What does that mean for God's credibility? What does that mean for the root of my tradition that says I'm created in God's image? What about that? Was that ever true? So even as people step away from religious institutions, it may impair their ability to have even a private spiritual life, a private God relationship.
If they're able.
And yet I'm very pleased that many religious institutions have taken good steps in the last 20, 30 years, to a large degree by the Faith Trust Institute's leadership, with Marie Fortune's book that came out. And I am appreciative that some faith communities have done work to put in place structures and procedures and policies to give people voice who didn't have it before, because it's one thing to be abused and another thing to be not heard after the abuse takes place. And so hopefully there's been a little bit of good work done, but there's so much yet to do.
And so that brings up the question, what needs to be done? If you were to list one or two elements that really need to be steps that are taken, what would you suggest?
Most recently, there was a case of a rabbi who was moved from one congregation to another. Their rabbinic organization knew that they had perpetrated in their last community, and in this movement, you can go through a process of reconciliation with the rabbinic organization, and they'll place you again. And so this person was placed again in another congregation and perpetrated again. And so I feel at this point, it's really important that religious institutions commit to not placing people again and in other communities if they have any infractions of sexual nature. It's not healthy for the individual. It's not responsible to put them in another situation. Being a congregational clergy member is a very difficult job. It's very high stress. It's very emotional. And if you're not at your A game all the time, it can really, really take you down. And so it's really important for the institutions to know it's irresponsible of us to put someone in a situation where they could hurt others and also hurt themselves and their families. And that's the main change I would like, is no more moving people around, period.
So the question then might come up is, what must men do differently? Or perhaps some of them are doing it, but if you were to speak to a man who encounters this not as a perpetrator, but as one who hears about this, suspects it, what do they need to do differently?
I would say they should resist tribalism. That's one of the things that is so disturbing, that there are some, men and women, but particularly per your question, men will say, well, I'll keep this quiet. You know, his reputation's at stake. No one shouldn't, we shouldn't ever erase a person's ability to make money for themselves. We should, just take care of this in a quiet way. And essentially it's tribalism where, like a fraternity where you keep things quiet and we'll deal with this within. And but that is such a dangerous and violent action. Because, first of all, you're invisibilizing the person that has been destroyed and traumatized, but you're also complicit with the person who has performed the sexual assault or what have you. So, for me, I would say men need to resist when they hear of something. Resist this sort of ability to connect with the other and to hide and participate in that regard. Because unless we are speaking truth to power, I'm not sure how we're going to turn this thing around.
I would say call each other to account. Whether it's in public, whether it's in an institutional framework, or whether it's, as our president once said, in the locker room, even in those secret male spaces. Speak up and begin to change the culture of acceptance around this behavior.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we also need a different vision for what it means to be a man. And that's a long conversation, but I think so many men believe or have bought into the notion that to be a man is to have power over others. And I would say that we've got to deal with that. Men need to lift up a different vision that what it means to be a man is to have power with others in the healing and creation of the world. And that giving our life in service of that is what makes us men, is what makes us human beings. And to do so in deep respect, not only of other people, but women in particular, who in this cultural context have not been recognized as made in the image of God in terms of the way we treat other people.
And what would you say to women, particularly young girls perhaps, that are coming up through school into the professions? What advice would you give them? Because we have a lot of parents undoubtedly watching
I'd
this.
say boys too.
Absolutely.
And that
Terry,
was going to
your
be my next
story
question.
highlights
Absolutely.
that basic honoring of a human person, bearing the divine image. I mean, that's something that in our religious traditions we can teach our kids. And to know that you carry that and you deserve to be treated and honored and respected that way. I think that's the foundation of kids being able to speak up.
Absolutely.
But we also need to give them trusted adults who will believe them and come by their side, and
exactly
a
right.
system that can act when necessary,
That's right.
both within our religious communities and in the broader society. Some of these things that happen in churches, for instance, are not against the law, and we have to deal with them, right?
The other thing is, I would tell children, I would tell Kelle, the child, to hold your story and to not be seduced to stay quiet for these folks who say, why did it take 20 or 30 years for you to come forward with your story? It may take that long for someone to listen and take you seriously. So hold your story, honor your story, and don't chip away at it so that it becomes, well, was it that bad? Or, perhaps it wasn't what I believe. No, hold your story and honor the sacredness of who you are and what you went through.
Yeah, we come from these ancient, deeply rooted traditions, and I believe that they offer something to the world that secular culture doesn't offer. And one of them is an ethic around how we communicate with each other. And if we want to encourage people to speak up, maybe to rebuke another for their behavior, we also can bring to the table what our traditions teach about how to do that, how to speak up, how to call out or rebuke in a way that's ethical, a way that honors the community. How do we take responsibility one for the other and make sure it's done in a sacred context? And those are all things we can offer children today for how to navigate this world.
Well, speaking out is definitely a major part of this whole Me Too movement. The orientation of society to it is going to continue to evolve. And I feel that with the points that you've articulated, we're going to take at least a few steps toward that for the people that are watching. I'd like to thank each of you for being a part of this program. I hope you'll join us again. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us on this Challenge 2.0.